Thank you. I'd like to invite the four presenters in this session to come on up. And we want to have a discussion, if they have things to say, among them. And I'd also like to give particular attention, if people want to join in, to other people who are on the program, the Chiasmus specialists who are here. If you want to join in, and then the general audience too. I think there are microphones out there. I don't know that I really need to prime the pump. Are there any comments that any of you want to make? Any of you sitting here, any of the presenters out there? And then there's some questions that are coming up from the audience. Any observations you want to make or reactions to any of the papers that have been given?
I was just going to comment that the use of computers to attempt to discern the presence of a chiastic structure in a text is a monstrous task. It may be that it may lead to being a useful aid, but I can hardly feel comfortable for these poor computer programmers who are not only going to be looking for synonyms and antonyms and word pairs, but ideas. And how do you distinguish a keyword or phrase or idea in a substructure from that which is meaningful to an overall structure? I have a difficult time understanding that. I simply have to fall into Noel Reynolds' school immediately on that and say, you have to have a developed literary judgment and read the text 50,000 times before you even conclude where it starts and where it stops, much less what the overall structure is and what the lower structures are, level by level. But let the computer programmers continue their work because it's very important.
I think one point, as a starting point, just a little illustration I would like to give before lunch here. And I'm going to use the Hickory Dickory Dock to illustrate this. When we think of Hickory Dickory Dock, you're familiar with Hickory Dickory Dock. The mouse did what? Ran up the clock. Then what happened? The clock struck 1. Then the mouse ran down. Hickory Dickory Dock. The point of all chiasmus is for memorization. That's the point. That's the point of it. It's done in an oral culture. We're trying to study it in a culture. We've got books galore. So we're trying to figure out how do you do this, but we've got to keep in mind. And so, is it sacred literature? Is it just a Hebrew thing? Bear in mind, it's an oral culture thing. So 1st century and before, every culture is oral culture, by and large. Even literate cultures, Hebrew culture could write. There were Hebrew schools, kids would go to school, boys especially, as 5-year-olds and so on. But who could own a book? Books were so expensive. And so while there was a lot, illiteracy rates were high. Even if you could read, you couldn't own a book. So the point of structured text, not just chiasmus, whether it's parallelism or other kinds of structured text, the point with it was that. This afternoon, you could think of Hickory Dickory Dock and think of 5 bags of chips and the colors. Why? The point is memorization. So now put words to it. So whether it's repeated words, or as Noel just said, maybe it's historical events that match up. Or maybe it's another sort of thing, not just the repetition of word, but now it's an actual event that took place, the progression of a story, or whatever it is. It doesn't have to just be an event or a word and a word. But it's the repetition of concepts, of words, of events, of a behavior or whatever that the readers can see. It's memorizable. That's the point. And so it's hard for us when we don't have to memorize anything. You know, all the computers and all the books and so on. It's kind of hard for us to get into the mind of the ancients as to why it was even done. And so for me, in thinking of structured text, to try to put myself into the mind of the writer and the readers, what is memorable about this? What's the memorable punchline and so on?
Stephen is assigning these questions to some of us at the table, which has passed them all down to me. Fortunately, some of them are very brief, and the ancients used chiasmus, but did not call it chiasmus. Well, what we have, the access we have to what the ancients taught is through the writings of their students, who didn't talk about their training, but they're prophets writing prophetic messages and so forth, the books of the Bible that we have now. So this is all, we're guessing at what they actually were taught. We don't have their textbooks, but some scholars have speculated that the idea of a chiasm as such wasn't what they were being taught, but we can't defend that. Given the complexity of the Book of Mormon chiasms and other linguistic devices used by Mormon and Moroni, do you think it more likely that a copy was made before the engraving was done? And I don't see how they could have done it without writing paper copy work first. Have you ever noticed when Nephi actually started to write the book of First Nephi? We're told explicitly it's 30 years after they left Jerusalem when he started to write it. And it took him, and then he comments a few verses later that now 10 more years have passed and he's only made it to 2 Nephi chapter 5. I think that having myself written a lot of things, I don't see how you do it without going through drafts and planning and so forth. So I assume he did. And finally, and I think this is a nice point, and it hadn't occurred to me, somebody is quoting Ether chapter 12, verse 25. I'm going to assume they've quoted it correctly. Wherefore, when we write, we behold our weakness and stumble because of the placing of our words. That doesn't seem to be a reference to engraving, so what is it? Does it relate to what we're talking about? Very possible. I think that's a very insightful observation.
Okay, I've got an assignment to respond to this question. What is your feeling about the probability that a 23-year-old Joseph Smith understood and added chiastic structure to the Book of Mormon? Jack Welch has written about that, and he looked, I think the last publication he did on that, oh man, it was 10 or 20 years ago, but he looked at the books that have been published on the subject of chiasmus and asked what the likelihood, okay, what's that? Okay, what the likelihood is that Joseph Smith had read those books. He certainly, as far as we know, never said, hey, I've noticed this inverted parallel structure. I don't know of any instance of that in his writings. And I think it unlikely is the short answer to this question. I might also add in response to Stephen's comment about will we ever use computers to identify chiasms, and I totally agree with him that, in fact, I've been approached about that. Well, could you write a program that goes and looks for it? And it just seems impossible to me, just because it's just really hard.
Stephen Scott. Stephen Scott. He's from Ottawa, and he has a comment.
I used to be from Ottawa, so that's a bit. I just wanted to emphasize it's Douglas's comment on it being from an oral society, and we also, I think, have to be very careful when we use words text and written, because in a primarily oral society, these compositions, they weren't texts, were evolved in the mind. So the person creating these long texts needs these memory devices to be able to compose it in the first sense. And I think what we have as text was really what I would call oraliture, as in oral, oraliture, not literature. And so I think that's very important. Just also in general comments, we really have to respect the composition and really study that. And that's why I really appreciated your study here on that. And I really loved what you talked about, Stephen talked about, in the case of respecting the different levels, whether you're talking micro level, mid level, or macro level. Different criteria are going to respond. Words are going to be very important on the micro level, and I don't think that can be emphasized, because a lot of people are scared about macro chiasms and proposing them and whether agreeing to them, because once you get on the conceptual level, it's harder to measure. It's very easy when you have the same words repeated to say things, but when you're talking about concepts, it does get complicated. And I think the final thing I wanted to add just on the general discussion was we do also have to be very careful of imposing our own modern values. And I think a key one of perhaps I like to point out is one of the ones you mentioned in, sorry, I've forgotten your name. Neil mentioned in his presentation of 6 sort of generally accepted criterias. And one of those is that each side has to be balanced in size. Now, that is really an aesthetic value, which we would like to have, perhaps. Does it mean that people, when they composed stuff in the ancient world, believed in that and felt that? Because I actually feel that John, the Gospel of John, when you'll see my presentation, is quite lopsided. The second half is a lot longer, on each of the levels than the first half. So that's just my comments on that. Thank you.
Yes, thank you for that. And I do want to point out, I completely agree, and I that's part of the point I tried to make in my own presentation is if we get so caught up in constructing some kind of criteria that we like, that we think identifies this, I think we're going to miss a lot of what the actual ancient authors are trying to do, and Noel appears to be getting at that a lot as well. With that in mind, though, I have been assigned a question. So it says, is it likely that sometime in the future, since we now have a number of experts that will come together and that we will have a number of experts come together and produce a definitive list of Chiasmus criteria? I don't think it is likely, but I do think, and with that in mind, though, I also that. In my experience, that's not really how the academic process tends to work. It's not this put everybody, it's not like the Council of Nicaea where you put everybody in a room and they come out with a definition of what God is or whatever. It's a longer process, and they develop over time what they think works. And what I do think we can optimistically look forward to seeing is in time, as more and more scholars comment on what they think works in identifying criteria, and as other scholars look at what they're doing and comment it back, and there's this dialogue, I think over time we can see a consensus emerge through that process, get to a point where nobody feels like they need to reinvent the wheel on criteria because they think what's out there is already sufficient. So,
My question is rather simple. Would the gentleman in the green shirt identify himself? My name is Douglas Buckwalter. You can call me Doug.
I will turn it over to Noel, and then I'll have one last question.
Well, I wanted to express a minor dissent from Doug's emphasis on memorization. I think in the general case and in general, the literature we find, I think that's a very defensible position. Thinking again about Nephi. Nephi's small plates seem to have gotten lost. Mormon finds them later and doesn't seem to be familiar with it. And it doesn't appear that Nephi's writing it to be memorized, and it doesn't show up in later texts being quoted in memorized form. So I'm just lodging a minor qualification on that. The first Book of Mormon in this question, the first part of the Book of Mormon, okay, the small plates, are different in that Mormon did not condense them. How does Chiasmus survive condensation in the parts that Mormon did write? And I think the Alma 36 that's been referred to this morning is a good example. Mormon obviously just had to excerpt that from the records he was, and he does that with a lot of things. He's excerpting, other times he's condensing. So, and you, as the reader, get to decide when he's doing what.
And I would just add a point. The next question is basically the same, and I wanted each panelist to jump in on this. It asks, is it the consensus of the panel that it's all about memorization, underlined, or ... question mark? Well, it uses the word all, so we already know that that question is leading me down the path. Of course, on a shorter passage, especially a poem like Psalm 23, it probably is about memorization, at least in the sense of passing it along from one originator, David, to those who are singing it. But longer passages, I kind of doubt it. After all, the Book of Mormon itself, as its own text says that it is written for our day and was not written for them. And maybe there was nobody to memorize anything that was written on the plates. I could ask for other comments as well.
We're approaching the end. We've actually approached it, so be brief, because we're cutting in on their lunchtime.
I don't want to cut in anybody's lunchtime, but I did just want to say I do think maybe all about orality and memorization is an overstatement, but in every, and I'm not the expert on any of this, so just take it for what it's worth, but in every literary every type of literature I've seen where chiasmus shows up, whether it's Greek or Hebrew or Maya texts and other things like that, there's a consistent pattern of it showing up more frequently in texts that were oral rather than originally written. And so there seems to be a very strong oral component to it. And there have even been studies, Steve mentioned the Book of Mormon, there have even been studies that have argued that chiasmus and other parallelisms show up more in oral texts like King Benjamin's rather than texts that were originally written in the Book of Mormon. So I think there is a very strong oral memorization component to it, yes.
Is that good? Okay.
Do you have any comments?
Well, I do, but I'm not going to give them. So I'd like to thank everybody who's been involved in the panel and the discussion.